Great. Okay, so my challenge to all of you is when you're done listening to Rita, giving all this great wisdom, you go in and do one more employer you didn't talk about. That's your wild card. Okay? Rita Carey is a very good friend and colleague. Is a wealth of experience in job search and in career transition. She has developed a phenomenal niche for those of us over 21. And she's going to talk to you today a little bit different take on what happens once you land that position, okay? But for those of you that are interested in all the other things she does around 40 plus, she's also going to let you know where she's going to be doing that so you can catch her other workshops, okay? So I'm going to hand it over to Rita. Well, as I said again, welcome. We're really glad you're here. Thank you so much, Rita.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry we don't have enough chairs, and I'm going to ask you, because I like to walk around when I do presentations. In the back, if you can't hear me, just wave your hand and I'll raise my voice again. My kids would say I should be able to do that really well, but I'd kind of gotten out of practice. They're not in the house anymore. So it looks like, you know, I used to call my series the 50 plus series, and at the end of some of the workshops that I would do, people would come up to me afterwards and say to me, I hope it was all right, but I'm only 45. Can't hear me? Okay. So when this, better? So when this was called the 50 plus series, people used to, it's like the only place people pretended to be older than they were. And then they would come up to me afterwards and apologize because they were only 45, you know. And so I said, you know, I think we have to drop it down because apparently, I mean, they were there because they were experiencing, I think that, I don't want to say discrimination because I have to tell you that in my view, if you feel that age is getting in the way of your getting a job, it's, as you know, if any of you have been in my webinars or in my workshops, it's really about perception of age. It is not about a number, and it is not usually about intentional discrimination. But it is about beliefs about us. And because there are different generations in the workplace, at least 4, and we each look through our own lens. So today, what I wanted to talk about, and I'll tell you why, I hate to stand still when I do this, but you're not going to be able to hear me. I'll tell you why I started this was because a number of people were getting jobs and then not getting through the probationary period. And these were people, you know, over 40. And I began talking to people and talking about that experience, about getting that new job. Maybe you've been somewhere on a very long-term job. Maybe you were at Kodak or Xerox or somewhere where you spent 20 years. And now all of a sudden, here you are, like you're the new kid on the block, but you're not a kid. And we approach our work differently. The different generations approach their work differently. And there's some things that it will be helpful to be aware of as you go into a new job, so that if you choose to leave, it is your choice and not theirs. So that's what we're going to talk about today. First, let me ask you, oh, here I go. First, let me ask you, how many people have gotten a job within the last couple of years? Maybe a temp job or a contract job, right? Right. And so how many felt they had a really good onboarding process? I mean, were any of your experiences ones where everybody kind of helped you out with everything and you knew where everything was and you understood what you were to do? How many feel they had a really good orientation? I don't see one hand. Wow, isn't that a shortcoming? That's a shortcoming. So sometimes you have to make it happen. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about a little bit about what you have control over, but we're also going to talk about some of the pitfalls when you're working with younger people. Just one second. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Ah, good, I can move. Great. That was too constraining. Okay. So if you didn't have a good onboarding experience, you know, and people, there wasn't a good orientation process. Tell me what it was like. What was somebody share what the experiences were like getting somebody who's gotten one more recently, you know, in the last couple of years. Yes?
The way it was presented, it was a 2-day intensive, all the things I would learn and know before I started on day 3, but they actually didn't perform everything that was in the handout that they said they were going to do. My computer wasn't working, I didn't have half the applications, and it took like 3-4 weeks before I had everything I needed to do my job properly. So I'd lost all that time. Very, very frustrating. And plus my printer, they got me a brand new printer. They hooked me up across the hallway, and the first time I went to print, I printed this 30-page manual. Printing. And then the person across the hall ran over and brought me 3 copies. So it was, you know, it was frustrating because you're calling people for help and they're saying, oh, but we tested yours. There's the test page. Well, I guess they tested it, changed the settings later.
So it looks like you're incompetent, right? Look, 3 weeks into it and you're not really hitting the ground running. How about another experience? Yes?
I started a new position, and the day I arrived, the person who hired me had left the day before.
The day she arrived, the person who hired her had left the day before.
My department had my boss, my supervisor, and the other people were happy that I was there, but weren't very, actually hardly at all helped me. My assistant coordinator wasn't even interested in working with me. Didn't even know me. It was very
Doesn't it seem strange that here you are new on the job and people don't automatically assume that they better give you heads up on some things and help you out, and there you are, and trying to do a good job, wanting to make a good impression. How did you handle it?
Well, they also wanted me to go on a business call early, which I did, but I didn't have business cards for 2 months.
You didn't have business cards for 2 months. Yeah.
I mean, I could order them online. It ran in 3 days.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, it's a shame. I talked with a woman once about a year ago who is highly skilled. I believe I'm not exactly sure, but I think she was a technical writer. And she would be brought in, she worked by contract. That's how she worked, and that was fine with her. But she was under a tremendous amount of stress because she was telling me how you never knew if you were doing it right. You never knew to whom you should go. You know, you didn't have the information you needed to look competent. She was competent, and she was telling me that it would have been so helpful if she could have known who was going to read what she was doing afterward, so she could have a clearer understanding of what they would be looking for. Here's the person who's going to evaluate her work, but she didn't even know who that was. And so we were talking about what can you do when you first go in. So although this isn't really, I'm going to spend more time on other things, but let me just spend a little time here. You probably already thought about this, and if you had this experience, you may have tried to do this. But what I suggested to her was, when she went in that first day, the person she was to meet with, she start right out by saying, I want to do a professional job for you. I want you to have a product that is high quality. And so this is what I need to know in order to do that. And we spent several phone sessions walking through this, what the language would be. It was always about the other person, the company. It wasn't about, I need this because otherwise it's very hard for me to do my job. No, she didn't say that. She kept talking about doing a professional job and providing a quality product. And so sometimes, you know, now, I didn't stay in touch with her, and she didn't stay in touch with me as she moved forward in her career. After we worked these things out, she kind of had a plan. We did some other things in terms of personality styles and how to communicate with different kinds of people. But I don't know how well that worked for her, because you could go in and do all of that and still not get the response you want, right? But it might be worth a shot, but always keeping in mind you want to approach it from their perspective. You want the best from me, this is what I need. You want the best product here, this is what I need. And be clear about what it is. And one of the things is like, who's the go-to person, right? So it may be minimal. A perfect beginning would be very different. So let's do a little questionnaire here, a true or false questionnaire. Mark, there are 10 questions here, so maybe write 1 through 10 down and write down your answers. So what do you think? Is the number one problem most employers have with new hires that they don't learn the tasks of their new jobs quickly enough? That's true or false? The best strategy to make a good impression on your new employer is to find something really outstanding to do as soon as possible. True or false? It's important that you get past the new employee stage as quickly as you can. True or false? The lessons you learned in your previous organization will be welcome suggestions for change in your new company. See, you're all too wise. You saw through that one right away. You can count on your new boss to help you get started, right? And being a new employee is not as hard when you've had previous work experience. Your coworkers will be happy to have you join the group. We just heard a few messages to the contrary. It's good to let people know what your style of working is so they can adjust. Your boss will have a pretty good idea of how you can be most productive. And because of your experience, you should be quick to point out mistakes as you see them. Right. I mean, some of those are so obvious, but some are a little bit less so. For instance, the first one, the number one problem that employers, you know what the literature says? There are two messages when you start researching this question. One is they just didn't fit in. And that's a common answer. They didn't fit in. And the second one, sometimes employers will say, well, they just didn't meet my expectations, but that's too broad for us to know what that means. So they didn't fit in. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, how can we, if we really want this job, or we really want to do a good job, or at least we want this job for now, if we really want to be seen as a competent employee, what are some things we can control? What can we do? So to answer some of the questions, obviously that's the answer to the first one. The answer to the second one, that's false. The best strategy is you have to be really careful about trying to make a good impression, especially if you've got more experience, because it's a funny thing, but we look through different lenses. And young people that are younger than we are, particularly if your boss is younger, people who are younger than we are, when we're trying to make that good impression, it can have it's funny, but they can look at that negatively. So you have to be careful in the beginning. You're really treading water in the beginning. You're building relationships, and I'll go into some of the other challenges in the beginning. It's important that you get past the new employee stage as quickly as possible. What do you think about that one? I mean, I'm not even sure what the new employee stage is. What I think is, if it means jumping in and acting as though you've been there for 20 years, I would say that's not a good idea to do too soon. Because the people, you think about it yourself, you may have had this experience, you haven't earned your wings here yet. You haven't. You haven't been here through the other stuff. That's why you never, 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 if you as an experienced worker want to go in and recommend the way that they change things, not in the beginning. You might go in there, I've talked with people who said, oh my God, the way they set up their administration, if they just did this, it would be half the time. So person could see immediately a better way to do it. And, from what I heard, I believed she was right. But you can't do that in the beginning. You cannot do that because even though it might help the organization, the people don't like it. So especially if you're more experienced, yes.
Just my take on it was you don't want to be asking the same questions more than once. Like, every day go in and, show
Right.
you don't never have to do something.
So that's right. And so whether or not it depends on what you mean by the new employee stage, but what you don't want to continue to do, which is just what you said, is be dependent. So you don't want to be too dependent all the time, and that's one of the ways, asking the same questions over and over, leaning a little bit too much. You can't rush that stage. The fourth one is false, and you knew that. And the fifth one is false, that you can count on your new boss. You can't count on it. It would be wonderful if it happened, but you can't count on your new boss to help you get started. Most of the openings today are in the small to mid-sized companies. But no matter what size the company today, people are you know this already. People are working with a much smaller staff, number of employees than they ever had before, and productivity is up. Productivity was up this past year significantly with fewer employees. But what that means is your boss isn't going to be that accessible. And your boss isn't going to want to keep having you ask questions. So we're going to talk about some other ways maybe to handle that. Now, let's see, did I miss some here?
Yeah, they're not there. Yeah, you read 7, 6, or 10. You read them on.
Okay, so the best strategy to make a good impression, did I go through that? You want to be careful about that. You know, don't do. You want to be of value quickly, but you don't want to jump in there and try to make a name for yourself too soon. It's the same thing. It's because you've got to learn your wings. Earn your wings. Okay, next slide. I want to get through these because we got a lot more to do. Do you think it's not as hard to be a new employee when you've had previous experience?
Just as hard.
Just as hard? A new employee is a new employee, right? Yeah. In some ways, it could be a little harder because you know more, but you might be working with people who know less. Your co-workers will be happy to have you join the group. Well, we heard that that's not always the truth. It's good to let people know what your style of working is so they can adjust. You knew that wasn't true. And so, let me get back here. Your boss will have a pretty good idea of how you can be most productive. I mean, sometimes you run into a great situation where the boss sits down with you, but if you don't, we're going to talk about some ways to handle that. And of course, you wouldn't point out mistakes. I mean, this group is too wise for that, too savvy. And you know, you cannot ignore the feelings, because I don't know about you, but I walk into a new place, I don't feel included right away. And so there's some concern about whether I'm going to fit in. And I'm older, but I'm new. And I want to tell you, I don't know if it's true for you, but it is true for most adults. We do not like being in that not knowing place, because we have developed a lot of know-how, a lot of wisdom over the years, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in this place where we're less comfortable, and we have things to learn. And here you are at the lineup again when you thought you had run the race, right? A lot of people are where they never thought they'd be. So you have 90 days. You have 90 days to figure out how this is going to work for you. How are you going to be effective in this environment? How are you going to earn the confidence of your boss and the respect of your colleagues? And how are you going to establish a reputation as a valuable employee? Well, first of all, let's take a look at what you're dealing with. You're dealing with, in most cases, not all, 4 generations in the workplace. A number of people have told me that in their interviews, it's a number of people, 50, 60, and over, have gotten interviews, which means that I know of, that means that their resumes were good, right? And they obviously had the skills, but they aren't getting the offers. And that is a real concern to me, because I don't understand that. If the resume had all of the right stuff on it, they don't want to interview for the fun of it. They brought you in, so why is it not happening? One of the things that's being said to a number of people is, this is a young workforce here. And it's said in a way almost to imply that you probably aren't going to enjoy that, or you're not going to be comfortable. You know, we have a pretty young workforce here. And so that could be true. So these are some of the generations that are in the workplace. And what's helpful is if we're aware of our perceptions of each of those generations, and if we have some understanding of that, because the bottom line, the reason people lose jobs is because they don't fit in. And so how do we fit in when there are people that are very different from us, who have a different way of working, have different values, etc.? Well, one of the ways is to understand it. And so if you looked at the, Gen Xers on the job, well, let's look at those traditionalists, or the boomers on the job. Probably some of the people in this room And so these are the characteristics according to a book that is cited later in another slide, that our assets, the boomers, the assets of the boomers, service-oriented, willing to go the extra mile, good at relationships, want to please, and good team players. Those are the assets that we take into the workplace in that particular generational group. The Gen Xers, 32 to 52, their assets are adaptable, techno-literate, independent, unintimidated by authority, right? Now, can you see how we would view that negatively? Those are considered assets, according to the literature on the different generations at work. And they're considered assets, but we're looking through our lens. And then if you could have some people that, you know, are in their 20s and early 30s. Their assets are optimism, tenacity, multitasking abilities, technology savvy. And the interesting thing about that is that we usually don't see some of those things as positive. Multitasking, and I've had so many people say, young people today, all they do is they're first on their iPhone, and then they're on, you know, then they're in LinkedIn, and then they're over here, and then they're over here, and then they're over here. Doesn't matter if they still perform. It doesn't matter, but it's different from the way we do things, and so we see it as a negative. That shows. It shows right away. So we have to be careful. We have to recognize the differences, because for the liabilities for that group, the Gen Y, nexters sometimes they're called, the liabilities for them is that they're going to need supervision and structure. They don't create that structure for themselves. And of course, they're inexperienced, and particularly with handling difficult people issues. And the reason I think this is important to point out is, remember I said people, the older worker is getting the interview but not being made the offer. And my belief about that is that all of the wonderful assets that you have because of your experience, they're like leverage. They give you extra points, but we don't demonstrate those well when we're in the interview. We don't demonstrate those well. We talk a lot about how we can do the job, the tasks of the job, or that we have the, you know, directly related experience, and we have the accounting or whatever it is they need. But we don't talk about what we have that others don't have. Younger people have not had the work experience you've had. They do not know how to handle conflict as well. They do not know how to manage themselves as well because they haven't had the experience yet. Nothing wrong with them. We didn't either at that age. And you take that into the workplace. You take an ability in the workplace now to deal well with internal conflict. You should, by now, must have developed pretty good interpersonal communication skills. So what you have to be careful of is that you have all this, and you want to demonstrate that, and there are ways to do that in the interview. Then when you get the job, you have all of those skills. You want to be careful about talking down to those who don't. You have to be careful about the younger boss who's going to be intimidated by you. I think if we can just keep in mind that everybody has their assets and everybody has their liabilities. The liabilities, by the way, for the boomers on the job are listed as uncomfortable with conflict, reluctant to go against their peers, overly sensitive to feedback, and judgmental of those who see things differently. So you don't have to own those, but those are some tendencies of people that in that age group. So if we knew that about ourselves, we could be careful about that. We could make sure that didn't show up in the workplace. So the new kid challenge, you have to cope successfully with the differences, unlearn previous ways. There's some things we have to unlearn, and that's hard. Have to let go of the way you always did it sometimes, and you have to discover new ways and norms. And that's the name of the book that I cited. There's a couple of them. This is one, So You're New Again, How to Succeed When You Change Jobs, by Holton and Naquin. What is it like here? What's the culture like? First thing is to size up the culture, right? Have you noticed how different it is in one place over another? How some places are very open, very collegial. People are very collegial. The people talk to you easily. And you go somewhere else and it's very formal and it seems to be cubicle-centered and people don't seem to be sharing things. You have to size that up. You have to figure that out because you have to work within that culture. Who has the power? These are the things that, you know, there are politics everywhere. There are politics everywhere. I wish, you know, sometimes I wish there weren't, but there are. It's human. And so there are politics everywhere. So what you want to be looking at when you first go in is you want to be trying to figure out who has the power and who wants it. Because you don't want to be a ploy for that person. And there's often there's a person without power often. I don't know about your experiences. I've had worked in a lot of different places. I've seen that to be true. Where in this system is controversy? In the beginning, you're just observing. It's like research in the beginning. Where in this system is controversy? Who needs to be involved in decisions? Who, you know, have you ever, I don't know if this ever happened to you, it happened to me. When a big decision was being made, somebody wasn't included who should have been there. And you want to know that went nowhere. It was the right decision, but it didn't go because somebody was left out of the process. So who needs to be involved in decisions? And who are the relevant key players here? And you know, it takes a while, but I'm sure you've had this experience before. You start figuring it out. You just keep observing. And I read once that the friends that you absolutely ought to have are the IT manager, the veteran, the person who's been there a long time, the office manager / receptionist. And I was reading about this person. I thought this was great. He said, you know, nobody ever goes to the office manager unless they need something. Take him, her to lunch. Find out when the birthday is. You know, because you probably know this if you've been to interviewing workshops, but they're watching you from the very beginning. And if you're waiting in an outer office, that person is often, not every time, brought in to talk about the conversation in the front office and how the person behaved out there. I always did it when I hired. And so it's, you know, it's politically good, and hopefully it would be, you know, this wouldn't be unethical. You wouldn't do it if you didn't like the person, I guess. But you try to make friends with those particular people, especially, I think, for me, the IT people. I don't know about you, but I need to have a good friend there. Avoid, you know, I was working with somebody once who contacted me because she had gotten a new job, but what she was running into some things, and this is the way it was. When it was time to break for lunch, she didn't want to separate herself from people, so she went into, there was a break room, there was a place people went and ate lunch, and she went in there, and she found herself next to these 2 or 3 people each time, and eventually the conversation was how bad the boss was, how bad their supervisor was, how they should run things here, what they should be doing that they aren't doing. And she was in a quandary because she may not like that behavior at all. She didn't. That was her concern. She didn't want to say anything that was going to link her to any of that. But just by being present in that room, other people knew what these employees were like. By being present and eating lunch with them every day, she felt she was going to be associated. On the other hand, she said, they have the power to sabotage my work. And so what happens if I don't go in? And what happens if I set them aside because they were in her department? And what if I, you know, separate myself from them? So we had to think about the best way to do that. And what we came up with was she would eat in there a couple of times a week, but she would have a reason for not eating there the other times. You know, so she kind of decided what that schedule was going to be, and she set it up that way. And the second thing that we did was, politically, she could not alienate these people because they could sabotage her work. And so I said, you ingratiate yourself with people when you talk negatively about other people when they're talking. So like you're in their camp. That's one way. But there's another way. And the other way is to get interested in them as people outside of the work. So I said, how about starting out conversations like, when did you move here? How about asking about their children? How about shifting those conversations if you're going to have to be in the room with them, because she must not get caught up in that. And so that's what she attempted to do. We're looking for a strategy, but the point is you have to be really careful. You don't obviously avoid social. Do you know, have anybody in this room know anybody that in the first 30 minutes you knew them, you knew everything about their lives? Doesn't it kind of surprise you sometimes how open people can be? And it happens to me a lot too. So, but you don't want it. You want to be careful, because you don't, in the beginning, you don't know what the political scene really is. And you don't know what part of something you disclose is going to be taken. So be a non-committal listener. That was one of the things she did. Avoid the negative talk. And is there an ex officio leader in this organization? Because there are people who have power who don't have any hierarchical authority, but they have power in the organization. Just talked, excuse me, just talked to somebody who had to leave a job because something unethical was happening there, and she just couldn't do it. And so she left, but the important thing was that the person who was doing what was so unethical remained and still remains, because that person was a good friend with the decision maker. And so it's really interesting. You don't know who's got the power. That person who was, according to this person, participating in unethical, I do think it was unethical, but unethical behavior, she's still there because she has power. She has ex officio power because she's good friends with somebody. Haven't you known, I don't know how it was in your organization, but time and time again people say to me, when the layoff started, I was assured my job wasn't threatened. And there was somebody there who was never doing their part of the work, never doing their, I'm working with somebody right now who's in a terrible situation because this other person is not doing her work. And so she's a lawyer. My client is a lawyer. And she's looking elsewhere. But the point is, the frustration she feels then when she goes into her performance, so she takes it up to a point, and then she's angry, and then she lets off steam. So she just had her performance reviews, and that all went against her, even though she's carrying a bigger load than the other people in that department. It didn't matter, because relationships matter, right? So we have to be careful. Humility is a good thing. Adaptability is good. All of these things. It never occurred to me until there was somebody on the Today Show from one person was a career coach and the other person was from AARP, and they were talking about the difficulty they were talking about 50 plus job seekers and what goes wrong. And they said, for all of the discomfort of the employee, you have to keep in mind that the younger boss is very uncomfortable. And could think about it. And I remember one time I was trying to get somebody in this, I knew somebody in a company, and I was hoping he would hire this one person that I'd recommended. And he said to me, Rita, I never managed my mother. And he was serious. He didn't know how to manage somebody that was 20 years older than he was. He didn't know how he could take that role. And that was of concern to him. And they talked about this on the Today Show. They said, there's a great level of discomfort. How much guidance should I give? This is awkward. Will this person respect my authority? And watch it, because sometimes we don't. We don't. And how do I elicit the respect I should be given? Does this person see me as a competent professional? You who are more experienced, you have more experience than your boss, and you've maybe had these wonderful opportunities, and maybe you've managed more people than this boss manages. So how do you help that person feel regarded as a competent professional? It is absolutely essential that you do that. absolutely essential. Because you know what happens when we feel insecure and awkward? You won't hear him experiencing any of that insecurity. Instead, you'll hear him managing poorly because of this awkwardness, not quite knowing how to do it. So you may have to put your boss at ease. How do you think you might do that? How do you think you might help this person not to have that tension and that anxiety? How?
Like you say, taking a position of humility first and foremost.
A position of humility? Right. How would you show that?
In every way, from nonverbal to if I'm asked to do something, I would respond as if I was responding to an older boss or someone in authority.
Yeah. What else? And yes.
I would get it out on the table. What to say to the boss. So I realize there's an age difference here, but if you think of experience, you've been at this company longer than me. So I will follow your lead.
Nice. So it gives him the edge, doesn't it? Right. Yeah.
Would you suggest, I mean, I'm thinking, okay, you've got the job, but how did you get the job? How did it come to be that he would hire someone that was older than him and have to deal with this issue to begin with? So would that be something you would address in the interview?
How would you, in the interview, you mean in the interview?
Right, so that he would be comfortable hiring. I mean, maybe the boss just wouldn't even bother hiring you and then not have to deal with it at all.
Well, maybe the boss didn't interview you. You know, maybe you were interviewed and brought in through HR and the hiring manager, but maybe not the boss. But if you have an interview with the boss, that's, I deal a lot with that in a separate workshop because it's how you handle that interview is critical. And I don't think, to answer your question, is it Rosemary? I don't think, Rosemary, that I'd quite bring it up that way, but you can show your respect in that interview. There's a way in which to have a conversation in that interview that will I think could really help put that person at ease. So if you're interviewing with the boss, he brought you in anyway. You know, that's such a good question. So they hired you anyway, right? Okay. So you had the right skills. I was talking to somebody the other day who keeps getting these interviews and then doesn't get the offer. So he has the right skills, you know. So now you're saying, well, he actually hired you. So he must have been comfortable enough. You must have done well enough in your interview if you got hired. But before you're hired, then you need to make that person. And the way there are a number of things, and I don't have time to do this, Dave, there are a number of ways you can do that. You know, by asking questions, by showing your respect for the company, by having researched the company, knowing something about his background. Now, I'd be careful here. You know, you're not going to get too much into that by saying something about, I really respect the way, or I understand that you took this company from this to this, whatever. But, you know, showing that kind of respect for that person right in the interview. If you get in the job, though, what often happens, I mean, the interviewing you is one thing, then you get into the job, and now this person, you really don't know how to do it in this new place, and so you need some supervision, and now it's like less comfortable. He was in the top position when he was interviewing you, right? And he was comfortable enough, so you got there, so that's great. So now you've got to make sure you continue with some of the ideas that were mentioned here. Continue to show him respect. Let me tell you, you would be surprised how quickly, you know, you might say this never happens with you, but I think it happens with most of us, how quickly we talk down to people that are younger. We don't even know we're doing it. We either talk paternally or maternally. And there was a woman in one of my workshops, and it was on interviewing. And I was I was giving out the language you never want to use or anything, and we were kind of talking about this, and she put her head down on the table and she says, "Oh my gosh!" And so of course we all wanted to know. And she said, "I just had an interview yesterday," and she said at the end of the interview, he looked at his watch and he said, "I have to close the interview because I have to be at," and he named some place kind of on the outskirts of Rochester. And she said to him, "Oh, well," she said, "you know how you should go. You don't want to do this, and you don't want to do that, and you should do this," and she's giving him directions. And she said to me, "I know now, I sounded exactly like a mother, you know, taking care of her kid." go this way. So, you could, I don't know about you, but kind of watch it and see if you don't do that. How many people were in the workshop just before this where Karen was there and she was, isn't Karen's presentation style very representative of her age group? Wasn't it? It's kind of, I loved it. I mean, it was, in my view, it was entertaining and everything, but I heard some people talking about it, saying it was good, that there was good information, but kind of the way they talked about her presentation said to me they saw her as a little girl. You got to be so careful. You have to be so careful. And I have to be that careful as well. So we all do. Because he may overplay his authority or her authority based on that insecurity. So you ask advice. One way, obviously you don't want to be too dependent, right? You don't want to be leaning on this person. But asking advice, encouraging feedback, and always putting the person at ease. You know what I would do if I used to tell people when you go for an interview and they offer you several chairs to sit in, don't sit in the lowest one. Don't sit in the lowest one. But I'd sit in the lowest one when I met with my boss in the beginning. All kinds of you said nonverbals and verbals, they all communicate. The person also is going to be may not know how much to talk to you about. I mean, how much do I have to tell you? You've already had experience. I don't want to presume. This person wants to be very sensitive to the fact that you are more experienced. I don't want to presume that you don't know something. So it's going to be, or could assume that you know little, depending. So this is just to point out so that when you're there, you'll be conscious of the fact that it's an awkward time. But there's information you need to have. You absolutely need to have. You need to know, how does your boss want to receive information? How many people have had more than one boss? Yeah, right. And, so were they alike? I mean, not?
No.
Well, boss is a boss.
No. The first boss I had was getting ready to retire the year I got hired. Okay. The last boss I had is 40 years old.
Okay.
I'm 60 today, so.
Happy birthday. So there were two different age groups, so how were they different?
The first boss told me what I had to do and let me,
Let you do it?
The last boss was sort of like that, but I can't say, well, it's more technical now.
Did you have to be different?
Yes, I did. I started
Okay.
off, without a computer, and working through 4 computer systems while I was there.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the environment changed,
Right.
the tools changed, so we've all been through that, haven't we? But the other thing is, there's what they call the XY theory, X theory of management and the Y theory of management.
yeah, that too.
And the X theory of management, that's the person who must absolutely know everything you're doing, wants everything reported, may stand over you, may not, but wants to know everything, wants to have his or her hands in everything. The person, the Y style, is more like once they know you know it, just go with it, just run with it. And so you need to know, so what you need to know is figure out, and I suggest personally that when you, first on the job, these are the questions you ask. You need this information in order to please your boss. So how does your boss like to receive information? Does he want a weekly report? Is he going to meet with you monthly? How does he want it? Does your boss want to be involved or just kept informed? You need to know that. What is the best way to get help from your boss? And when do you need to be most available? It's not intentional, but it's natural that you're being watched when you're new, right? So you're being watched, and so when do you need to be most available? When do you want to make sure your boss sees you at your desk? It's recommended that, let's say you're in a situation where people come in at 8 and they leave at 5, and they don't usually work late. And you're new on the job, and you're thinking, I got a lot to learn here, and it's all right with me. I don't have kids at home anymore. I can stay a little later and do some things. My recommendation, go in earlier, don't stay late. Because it creates a different impression. It creates the impression of I couldn't get my work done, whereas going in early creates the impression of so eager to get started. Very different, isn't it? I used to stay late. I learned that late. I used to stay late, and that doesn't. So those are some things to think about. And also, eventually, because it may not be in your case, but in many cases, it's very hard to see the boss. It's very hard to get in touch with the boss. And so you've got to be noticed by the boss, number one, and you might have to have conversations with the boss. So when is the best time for you to be available? When, and that would be when he or she is most available. I used to do management coaching in international companies, and so I would work with managers, and the idea was they were having some problem with something, and this woman had been told by her boss that she better go take a workshop on conflict management, and she went into HR and she said, I don't need another workshop, I need a coach. And so she interviewed a few coaches and she selected me, and it was fascinating. She was in this one division of this international company. She was at the top of the salary scales, top of the line there, and her boss would not create a higher one. And he wouldn't allow her to get on cross-functional and interdepartmental teams. He didn't allow her to present anywhere. He had her like confined. And she said, I'm not going to, she said, sometimes I feel like I should apologize for this, but I want to be a leader. And she said, I can go nowhere here. I said, what's happening? Why isn't he letting you do these things? Well, in my work with individuals like that, what usually happens is, in the beginning, it's all about what's wrong with the other person. But when they trust me, they start talking, they're more honest about what's happening in those meetings with the boss, and they're telling things that they say and do. And about the third meeting, she was there, and so right away, somebody on the outside can see it so much better than we can when we're in the middle of it. It was necessary for her to change her behavior with that boss. She could not go into meetings the way she was going into meetings. So what we did was, I could kind of gather what he was like from what she told me. So we began to work on that, even to the point of, before she went into this one meeting where she felt she had a lot at stake, so she was really uptight about it. We actually did a phone session. She was in Washington, D.C. We actually did a phone session prior to her going into that meeting, where she got clearer and clearer and clearer about what is your ultimate intention here. Is it to make him wrong? Because she thought he was wrong about what he was doing. Is it to make him wrong? Okay, if that's your intention, is your intention to get him to help you to move up in your career? Keep your intention. And so we worked on how she might confront him in a way that wouldn't put him down, and we did other things. So you kind of have to know your boss, you have to know how to work with him, you have to have opportunities to, even informally to talk to him a little bit. So if he goes in early or she goes in early, some informal conversation about your family, not about any other employees, of course. So who's the go-to person in this organization? There have been a lot of studies done on the code. There's a go-to person in organizations. It's usually somebody who's highly regarded, and people keep going to that person for information. And what's interesting about that was before these studies were done, it was believed that this was a person who was highly political, and it's not that at all. It's the person who had integrity and knowledge. And this is also usually the person who is respected among all departments. How will your performance be evaluated in 30, 60, or 90 days, informally or formally? And you know what? I would bet you that most of the time we don't know that. We know what we're hired to come in for, but when somebody says you didn't fit in, then we obviously didn't know what they were looking for, did we? And so you really need to know how are you going to be judged. 1 month, and so a question I like, I would hope that when you first get in the organization, you have a conversation with your boss. And I would push for clarity on this, because otherwise you have no way of knowing how you're going to be judged. And I would say 1 month from today, or you could say 3 months from today, how will you know you made the right decision in hiring me? Because the way they answer that question is different than the way they say, what are the objectives, when you ask about, well, what are the objectives of this job and what's the primary task of this person, et cetera. They answer that usually very subjectively, and you find out what they really care about. So, you know, whatever you do in the very beginning, do everything you possibly can. I know it isn't always within your power to get as much information about what they really want from you as you can. Because you know what? If that was a position held by somebody else before you, there was probably a problem. Unless the person retired, there was probably, if there wasn't a problem, there was something they wished that person had been doing differently. And that's the irony about it, because when you're being interviewed, they're often focused on what didn't happen with the other employees, so they kind of are emphasizing that, and so you kind of get a warped view of things. How will your performance be evaluated in the first 60 to 90 days, informally or formally? One way you can show respect for that younger boss is to say, would you sit down with me in 30 days and give me a heads up in terms of how I'm performing? I'd really appreciate your feedback. Doesn't it show respect? Or 60 days, could we sit down, you know? So postpone the big, postpone those big showstoppers in the very beginning, because remember, they're still thinking about you as the new kid on the block. Takes a while to get past that. And conformity over individuality may be better in the beginning, depends on the situation. Acknowledge what you don't know. You know how you're in that situation, you don't know who to go to, or you don't know how they want this form done, or you don't know, there's a lot you don't know. When you don't know it, find it out, but don't make a big thing of it. Treat it lightly, just get the information you need. And if you make a mistake, acknowledge a mistake, but sometimes we are so concerned because we're new here, we're worried about being maybe older than the rest of the workforce, and now we've made this mistake that we just overdo our apologies. No. You learned, you made a mistake, you acknowledge your mistake, and you talk about what you're going to do going forward. Yes, apologetic, but not remorseful, right? So week one, you want to set a 30, 60, 90-day plan. So these are, and if anybody wants these PowerPoint slides, if you request them of me, I'll send them to you. And I think I'll give you my address in a minute. Objectives, the first, get a general sense of the workplace, and really work at clarifying your boss's expectations, organize yourself to learn. And one of the things that's really, if you can do this, it really is helpful. Of all of the tasks you've got, figure out which one, what segment of the work you do is most important. So that, because there's so much new, and there's so much to do, and there's so much different, that we may be just giving equal amounts of time to various functions, and maybe there's one that should be given more time. So try to identify where your greatest value will show up in this company. You never want to use the way we did it at. But I also want to say this, though. That does not mean that your past experience should be discarded. I don't mean that at all. Because you may have been in an organization that had already been through a lot of these things this organization is in, and you'd learned new and better ways. You just have to hold off on talking about that. But when they're receptive, there are ways to say, I'm wondering, I don't know the history here, but I'm wondering if you ever thought about, that's better than saying we did it that way at Kodak. But wonder if you ever thought about doing it this way. I know some companies, you can give your input, and if they say, gee, we never thought about that, how would we do that? And, well, I can show you some things if you want. And then you're adding value, but, your timing has to be right on that. Assuming, excuse me, I don't know about you, but in my lifetime, it has been wonderful to mentor people. And I have people who, written me recommendations and things that said, working with me, they learned so much. It was wonderful, wonderful to mentor them. I loved that role. But you can't assume that role. And, that's kind of like what that woman did when she decided she's going to tell him how to get to his location. You can't assume that you're going to be a mentor to somebody. You have to, but you may find yourself in that position, which I personally think is an honorable position. But you have to let them want it. And then, of course, obviously, the talking down to young coworkers. At the end of the first month, these are your objectives. You know, you should establish your coalitions, and you can read it. Identify the go-to person. We talked about that. What's your working relationship going to be like with your boss? What's going to work well? Build those relationships with care and avoid being corralled, and that's by, you know, if there's a negative group in the organization, you know, I don't know about you, but it's true for a lot of people. I know it's true for me, that being included is very important. And when I'm in a new place and I'm not feeling included, I'm uncomfortable. And I'm not included until I really feel a part of it. There's a real temptation at that point when, you know, for myself or people like me, to form a coalition with the wrong group because they're the group that will rope you in. So be careful about being corralled by a group that might not be in your best interest. I'm not saying this exists everywhere, but just in case. And of course, no negative conversations. The second month, now, you know, acquire some early wins. They might be small wins, but acquire some early wins. Help somebody else out. If you can do that, that's great. Track your progress. As you know, be thinking, you know, maybe at the end of each week you want to talk about how, kind of assess how you did that week. Check in with your boss and continue to try to find out where you can add value. And we talked about, you know, some of the biases, et cetera, to avoid. And by the third month, it's really important to get the big picture, you know. So gradually when you're in that company, you begin to learn what really matters to them, what their competition is, what their challenges are, what their concerns are. And so when you get the bigger picture, that's going to be important for you because that's how it helps you to understand where your value will be. So sometimes that isn't a natural tendency among some people. Some people, it's a natural tendency to want the big picture. Among other people, it's more a natural tendency to just need and want to know about their job. But it's important for your career that you understand the big picture. So take some effort at kind of looking at the overall situation, maximize your connections, and track your progress. And create healthy relations with all people across all generations. Plato says the beginning is the most part of the work, and you know it's the strangest thing, but you can't change a first impression. It doesn't seem fair to me that you can't, but you can't. I mean, maybe sometimes you can, but generally you can't. Remember, I met a woman once who said to me, I know right away whether I'm going to like that person or not. Well, I don't know right away. I don't, because my first impressions are never right, because my first impressions are through this lens that I look through, and it's not 20/20 vision. I have to know more about that person. But you know, it's very difficult if you get off on the wrong foot to correct it. It's so hard, and so we don't want to. So that was what this presentation was about. Just some thoughts, some hints, some ideas of things you might want to be aware of when starting the new one. And it came about because I was hearing about people who were getting a job and being let go at 45 days. You know, didn't even get through the probation period or got through the probation period and then were let go. And in fact, one person said to me, I'm not telling anybody I got this job yet because so many people I knew lost it after the 90-day probation period. And she said, until I'm through the probation period, I'm not telling anybody. That's sad. Isn't it sad? Now, there can be a lot of reasons for that you have absolutely no control over, so please, please don't take that all on your shoulders. They can change their mind. You know how it is. So it can't, you know, it's not necessarily your responsibility, but certainly you want to do everything you can. Upcoming library workshops in Fairport, Taking Your Talents to Work is Freelancing for You. You know, the big growth right now is people going into business for themselves, freelancing in a number of different ways, contracting, temporary work, etc. That's the way employers are hiring. Excuse me. So we're doing something on that. I'm doing something on that. Then the second one there at Fairport is the same as this, except there's more involved in it. We do a career relationship survey where people assess their own relationship abilities. And the first time I did that, you kind of get a relationship score. There was a gentleman in there who said to me, he had a long-term contract job somewhere, and he said when he finished it, he was really surprised because he thought he was more highly relational than this showed, and when he looked at the various things on it, it gave him some new ideas. But anyway, it's basically this. So at Gates Library, it's managing the online, offline job search. I'm going into LinkedIn and doing some work with LinkedIn and also job boards, some more stuff on the job boards. And then emotional intelligence in the interview. Employers are screening for emotional intelligence in interviews, and I'm going to talk about how they look for that, what it is, and how they look for it. I have a commercial video presentation on that. So those are some things that are coming up. And I also wanted to mention that I have a lot of free webinars on my website. So you're free to call in. Some of you have taken them, I know. And so that my website, and you can contact me through the website too. So if you have questions after this or things you think maybe I should know for my next time, it's rcmassociates.com, all one word. That's my website, and it says there's a place in there where it says Contact Rita, and you can contact me through that. And and if you need me to get back to you, I will certainly do that. So questions, comments, or hostilities? You can take them out of me. I can take it. Seriously, what do you think?
I have a question. Job I worked for, when we talked about forming coalitions, and also kind of a second question regarding what your boss expects from you. I had president, vice president, salespeople, and a CFO that I had to answer. And they all played against each other. And I'm curious, at times I really struggled with it. And I think that numerous times when I try to kind of work with one person, the others would find out, they would tell me, no, you don't need to contact him, he doesn't need to know everything. There was such a dynamic going on, and I'm curious, would there have been a better way? How would I go about trying to I don't want to say form coalitions. I literally had to get to a point where I had to stay independent because of that.
Yeah, so
and
what do you
alienated
do?
me from my employee.
Yeah, so any thoughts in the group? What do you do when you're reporting to a number of different people and some are telling you don't have to give that report to him, and you're getting, is there a boss?
Yeah, there's president, CEO. Yes.
Do you ever meet with him or her?
He was a micromanager. So he was involved.
Would that person tell you to whom you needed to report?
He did, but it was a very sales-driven organization, so the salespeople kind of dictated as well. And the vice president was one of the top salespeople, so he was the one that told me, listen, you don't have to give everything to the president. You can go through me sometimes. It always came back to bite me in the butt, so I don't really know. I don't know a better way to handle that.
I don't know. There are a lot of very experienced people in this room, but that sounds like a no-win situation to me. I mean, I don't know how you can win.
It's difficult.
What else? Other questions or comments? No? Yeah.
You had said as far as getting PowerPoint slideshow?
Contact me through that, okay?
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? Well, oh yeah.
A friend once told me that when you start a job, you should try to blend into the woodwork, sort of be like a fly on the wall or something, and just kind of observe and not get too much in advance, but just kind of, be very kind of with, just sort of hidden until you get the feel of the place.
Try to blend in until you get the feel of the place. Yeah.
Be part of the woodwork.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.